Good day. It's received a minimal amount of international attention, but Japanese Prime Minister Mr. Suga has just announced that he is stepping down. Now, the lack of interest in this news is really remarkable when one considers Japan's size and the size of its economy and the country's immense geopolitical importance. Contrast this with the interest that people are showing in the fact that Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, is stepping down, and there will be new elections in Germany to decide her successor in a few weeks, and that there will be, in the French elections that are coming up in April next year, which will decide the fate of French President Macron. Japan, both in terms of its population and the size of its economy, is a much bigger country than either Germany or France. It's also a key US ally. In fact, it is the US's single most important ally in the Pacific region, which is particularly important at a time when the United States is facing off against China in the Pacific. Last but not least, the fact that a Japanese Prime Minister is resigning is important, obviously, for the Japanese people themselves as they consider their future and the direction which their country is taking. Now, I understand that the reason that Mr. Suga has resigned is because of the growth of the pandemic in Japan, which I believe some people in Japan, whether rightly or wrongly, are connecting to the Tokyo Olympics. But it is the geopolitics of it that I intend to focus on this program. After all, this is a channel that focuses principally on geopolitical news. And it is a fact, a well-known fact, that relations between Japan and China have become extremely poor, that Japan has been aligning increasingly with the United States, and Japan, which is becoming an important naval and military power and military ally of the United States, has recently been making statements about its support for Taiwan and has been giving hints, which I've discussed in previous programs, that it might join the United States in the defense of Taiwan in the event that China decides to take steps to reabsorb Taiwan into China by force, as China has said that it might do. And it's the case that Mr. Suga has taken a strong anti-Chinese and pro-Taiwan line, just as his predecessor, Mr. Abe, who was Prime Minister of Japan, it must be said, for a very much longer period, did the same thing. So where does all this leave the politics and the position, the geopolitics in the Pacific region with the resignation of Mr. Suga? Well, the Chinese have already commented about it, and there's been the usual predictable editorial in Global Times. Now, I should say that for China, what happens in Japan is of immense and absorbing interest. The rest of the world may be indifferent to the fact that the Japanese Prime Minister has resigned, but China is not, and China cannot be. After all, in the last decade of the 19th century, and for much of the 20th century, China and Japan were enemies. Japan fought long, prolonged wars against China as it sought to control China and subordinate China to its own economic sphere. And it set up puppet regimes within China that the Chinese people resisted in a prolonged war, which is now gradually coming to be recognized as part of the Second World War. Moreover, it's also the case that the Chinese people had to endure enormous losses in defending their country from what they rightly construe as Japanese aggression. And this has, of course, coloured the Chinese people's conception of Japan and China's interactions with Japan. And it is also the case that many Chinese people, with, I think, a great deal of justice, feel that Japan has never fully accepted or recognized either the fact of its long aggression against China in the early 20th century, and has never, in fact, apologized or shown much remorse for that aggression. So the Chinese and the Japanese have difficult relations, and the fact that the Prime Minister of Japan has now resigned, of course, is something that the Chinese, as set out in Global Times, have taken note of. And I'm going to read the Global Times editorial about the resignation of the Japanese ambassador in full, largely because it does actually say some important things about Japan and China, and about the relationship between the two, and about the relative power balance between the two. And it gives some indications, in my opinion, about the direction that Japan is both travelling and which, in my opinion, it might seek to adjust and change. Anyway, here is what the Global Times editorial says. It says the following. The title reads as follows: U-turn in bilateral ties unrealistic regardless of next Japanese Prime Minister until China regains Tang Dynasty strength over Japan. Now, I ought to say that the Tang Dynasty, which ruled China from the late 6th century AD until the 9th century AD, was possibly the period of China's peak power under the previous imperial system that governed China until the Chinese Revolution of 1911. So when the Chinese refer to the Tang Dynasty and speak about this as a period of time to emulate, well, that gives us a sense both of the extraordinary stretch of Chinese history and of the longevity of the Chinese state. It is, in fact, the oldest state in the world, and also of the extent and depth of Chinese historical memory. But anyway, let's proceed with the editorial itself. Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga made a surprise announcement on Friday, claiming he will not seek re-election as leader of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. It means he is giving up the chance to continue serving as Prime Minister of Japan. The Japanese political arena will face a new shockwave. Since Suga became Prime Minister after Shinzo Abe resigned last September, he must call a general election and lead the LDP by November 28th, meaning his tenure can last at most 1 year and 2 months. Many people suspect that Japan will once again enter a period of political turmoil in which the Prime Minister changes frequently. That, by the way, is almost certainly correct. It's now becoming clear that the long period of Shinzo Abe's dominance in Japan was an anomaly, and we will have once more frequent changes of Prime Minister, though the overall rule of Japan by the Liberal Democratic Party looks secure. Anyway, to continue. The fundamental reason for Suga to give up the LDP's re-election is probably that he feels that his days are gone. The possibility of the LDP's various factions supporting him in the re-election is extremely low. His plan to adjust high-level personnel in the LDP has suffered a setback, and he will hardly ace the game in the upcoming election. So he could only make a quick retreat. Well, that paragraph may be right or it may be wrong, but it shows that, unlike other countries, China takes a great deal of interest in the perpetual factional infighting within the LDP, something which just doesn't happen in other countries, certainly not in Europe, and not even to any great extent in the United States either. And then to continue with the editorial, Suga's biggest failure was in the fight against the pandemic. Japan's daily case number has surpassed 20,000 on Wednesday. Japanese society is much more anxious about the pandemic than European and US societies. Such anxiety has overwhelmed the joy of holding the Tokyo Olympics. The pandemic is raging, and it is impossible that the Japanese economy will stay unaffected. Suga has almost nothing to maintain his approval ratings at a high level. As a result, Suga made the announcement on Friday, and the Japanese stock market rose sharply. Then we come to perhaps the more interesting parts. China-Japan relations under the Suga administration this year have been terrible, slipping all the way to a deep gulf from the evaluation of getting back on a normal track in 2018. No matter who becomes new president of the LDP and takes over as prime minister, a big U-turn in China-Japan relations is unrealistic. This is because the atmosphere about China in Japan is becoming increasingly unfriendly. The US's strategy of containing China also has a great influence on Japan. Japan does not have the conditions to promote a new route towards China, whether domestically or internationally. Well, that is probably true, but now we come to perhaps the hard issues, which are, for me, the single most important part of this editorial. The power comparison between China and Japan has changed historically. During the Beijing Olympics in 2008, Japan's GDP was still ahead of China. In 2020, China's GDP is about 3 times that of Japan, which is about the similar economic gap between the Chinese mainland and the island of Taiwan at the end of the 20th century. More specifically, China's vehicle sales in a year are 4 to 5 times that of Japan. The length of China's high-speed railway is about 13.7 times that of Japan's Shinkansen high-speed railway. The geopolitical implications of Japan's tough China policy is also changing quietly. It seems difficult for the hearts of China and Japan to get closer in the short and medium term. Japan has really thrown itself down at the US and can even neutralize the hatred of being attacked by atomic bombs and the humiliation of being occupied by the US military until today. Unless China can take a comprehensive lead over Japan, as it was during the Tang Dynasty, China will not generally respect China, nor will it show mutual respect to China in a short period of time. Japan's attitude towards China will be awkward for a long time. However, it is very difficult for Japan to pose a fundamental threat to China. Japan's long-term role will be as an accomplice to the US. We should accurately grasp Japanese society's attitude towards China, objectively assess Japan's threats, and determine how to deal with this neighbouring country. China-Japan economic and trade cooperation is huge, and this should be regarded as the most substantial part of the two countries' relations. no matter who the next Japanese Prime Minister is and whether Japan will have more tough voices against China, the two countries' economic ties are mutually beneficial and the scale of trade will hardly be impacted. It is also unlikely that Japan will take the lead in a showdown against China. These facts show that China has room to calmly deal with its relations with Japan. Now, I think the most important takeaway of all of this, and the point that Global Times and via Global Times the Chinese are making, is that though Japan is becoming more hostile to China as China's economy grows and becomes more powerful, that hostility is in inverse relationship to Japan's power over China. Whereas as recently as 2008, Japan's economy was bigger than China's, now China's is 3 times the size of Japan's. Moreover, and perhaps more tellingly, China's economy is roughly in the same relationship to Japan's economy as China's was to Taiwan's at the end of the 20th century. In other words, China already dwarfs Japan, and it will continue to do so, and the gap between the two economies will probably continue to grow until the point is finally reached when Japan's economy, and indeed Japan in general, becomes only a marginal nuisance to China. And what the Chinese are saying is that as China's economy grows, eventually Japan will find itself in the same kind of situation that it was during the previous period of Chinese ascendancy, all the way back in the time of the Tang Dynasty, all those years ago. And that what China needs to do is bide its time, and gradually its economic magnetic pull will eventually bind Japan with itself. Well, that may be right, or it may be wrong. It makes certain assumptions about the future growth of the Chinese economy, which perhaps some people would challenge. But I do think, again, the Chinese, perhaps rather too forcefully, are making some valid points about Japan. Because ultimately, one does question to what extent Japan's current hostility to China serves Japanese interests. I say that I appreciate that for Japan, the emergence of this Chinese colossus, especially one that has taken place so quickly, must be extremely unsettling. Since the end of the 19th century, Japan has always been, or has consistently been, the much richer country, the much more powerful country than China. And when China's economy began to open up in the 1980s, the Japanese, as I well remember at that time, had an even paternalistic attitude towards China. But things have changed, and things do change, and inevitably, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the growth of Chinese power has had an effect on Japan. It has unsettled Japan, and the Japanese say to themselves, well, this country, China, with which we once had a dominant relationship, but also, let's be frank about it, a somewhat abusive one, has now overtaken us and is dwarfing us, and that perhaps means that we have to adjust to that, and perhaps that means that we have to align more closely with the United States and take a stronger attitude to China than we once did. I think this is wrong. I think a much more sensible policy is the one that Vietnam has been following, which is to try to maintain equidistance between itself and China and Japan and, sorry, equidistance between China and the United States. I think that that is what ultimately serves Japan's long-term interests better. Yes, the Chinese and the Japanese do also have some actually fairly minimal disputes over certain islands. I think these could be settled very quickly, but then so does Vietnam also have similar disputes with China. In fact, Vietnam's disputes with China are on a bigger scale and ultimately more fundamental. Also, and as Global Times essentially says, I don't think there is any serious threat from China to Japan. I don't think that the Chinese have any desire, for example, to conquer Japan. Why would they want to? And it's probably the case that over time, Japan will probably find itself pulled ever more closely into a strong trade and economic relationship with China. But China does not have the kind of feelings towards Japan that it has towards Taiwan. And I can't imagine why China, which has never sought Japan's conquest, would ever want to do so in future. So I would have thought that if the Japanese can get over their issues with China and the history they've had with China, over time, a better relationship, a more amiable relationship with China would suit them better. But regardless, that's not the approach the Japanese are going to take for the moment. But let's perhaps take a step back and think about this also from a US position. Because, of course, the US is now counting very heavily on Japan and Japan's fleet to counterbalance the growth of Chinese power. And yet, what we see from Global Times is Chinese self-confidence, because they are taking in their stride the existence of this Japanese-US alignment. They're saying to themselves, well, Japan once exceeded us in the size of its economy, but now it is at the same level that Taiwan was at the end of the 20th century. We can bide our time, we can continue to build up our forces, and sooner or later we will be able to massively outmatch even those that the Japanese and the Americans together can throw at us. So the United States, which does indeed have hopes of trying to use Japan's military power to counterbalance that of China, might one day find that this is also a forlorn hope and one which does not actually assist the United States to the extent that perhaps the United States expects it to. Maybe this alliance with Japan will buy the United States a little more time, 5 years perhaps, 10 years conceivably, but it will not change the fundamental geopolitical realities of the Pacific region, where we see China's power and China's reach growing ever greater. So, what do both Japan and the US do? Well, as I've said, I think the Japanese need to adjust their diplomacy. They need to start thinking about pursuing a more equidistant policy towards China and the United States. But I think the United States also perhaps ought to consider whether an alliance with Japan against China ultimately solves its problems. I'm going to make a suggestion. I think that far from doing so, it's actually going to, in the long term, increase its problems. It's going to mean that just as the United States finds itself now having to defend Taiwan, which is indefensible, it could be drawn into a race with the Chinese colossus in the Pacific, which in the long term will oblige the United States to defend Japan as well, with Japan also becoming increasingly indefensible. I don't see how that would serve US interests. Perhaps predictions of Chinese economic and military growth are overstated, but my own view is that the growth of of Chinese power is indeed set to continue. Given that this is so, how much wiser for the United States also to make that deal with China, agreeing the red lines with China that I have so often discussed. That might mean making important concessions with respect to Taiwan, and it might mean accepting equidistance on the part of Japan between the United States and China. But neither of these things, in my opinion, impinge on core US interests. And I think a more realistic foreign policy for the United States towards China might be to pursue this route. Well, I have made this point repeatedly. I've said this time after time. At the moment, obviously, the United States is not pursuing these sort of objectives, but I hope that one day realism will break out in Washington, and that for its own sake, the United States will do so. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. Please also check Alex's channel, my colleague and friend Alex Christophorou's channel. You find links to all these channels under this video. And please also remember to check us out on our other platforms. Please, in particular, go to Locals, where we have a thriving community, where I am regularly posting material which you will not find on YouTube, including videos, by the way, and where I think you will find that we are increasing our footprint all the time, and where very soon now that the technology has been sorted out, I'm going to start doing live streams. And also, please check us out on the new free speech platform, SuperU, where we have high ambitions for what we're going to do. As many of you probably know, we've had recent problems with PayPal, which have made us feel that we are even more committed to developing our place, our footprint in these new platforms than we were before. So please go out and look us up there. Lastly, and in addition, if you want to support our hardworking channel, then please do so via Patreon and Subscribestar. You'll find links under this video. And please also go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there. Please also remember to press the like button to this video if you've liked this video. And please, lastly, check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.